Hey guys, we're here on day 28. Continuing our notes that we have been working on the last couple of days. So you're skipping down. We're going to be on the last page here of monopolies. And then after we talk about these monopolies, we're going to go back up to and get this part that's shaded in, filled in also. So anyway, we'll get started here. We're going to start you out with a quick daily blog. Go ahead and get your answer for that. Pause the video if you need to. Um, and we talk about these monopolies, and we started out before we talked about where we had tons of competition, and where there things were so competitive, and companies didn't have any control over prices, and so prices were cheaper for us, right? And the idea of most of us understand that if we're the only producer of something, we're going to be able to control the price, which is good for the consumer. I mean, sorry, good for the producer, bad for the consumer. Okay. Now, these monopolies, they don't necessarily happen like an all time occurrence, right? They're not necessarily things that happen always. Okay, so maybe hopefully you're coming up with somewhere where, oh, I was just kind of stuck in, for example, an airport to get food, right? Like a fast food restaurant in an airport. If you've ever been there, the prices are significantly higher than we would see just in a normal setting, right? It can be even more specific. If you've ever been in line at Cedar Point, for example, and after you wait in line, you get to these pop machines, and the pops in there are like $4 or $5 each, right? The bottle of pop. So, that's monopoly power because they know that if you want something to do in that line, you're going to pay that price to be able to consume their product. So this monopoly power happens quite often, but not necessarily always where we're absolutely stuck having to do something. Okay, so anyway, we're going to talk about these characteristics if they do pop up in certain cases, and they have over time. But the government also tries to prevent them. Okay, so we'll get started here. So here's your characteristics of what we are looking at. Okay, pretty straightforward. We know that there's only one producer. The product's got to be unique. Okay, so very few substitutes, if any, usually. All right, with these monopolies, it's got to be very difficult for new companies to compete. Businesses, just like kind of similar to like sports teams, it's a copycat thing, right? So if someone has a good idea, people are going to try to copy that idea. So whether it's a strategy in a sporting event or a sport, right, or whether it's like a smartphone. If those of you that may remember, like flip phones were really big, probably about 10 years ago, and the industry was going towards, let's make phones smaller and lighter so people don't have to be burdened with them. iPhone or Apple, sorry, comes out with their first iPhone. And the first iPhone was super heavy, not really super usable, wasn't user friendly, super expensive. And people laughed at it because everybody was like, well, why would you want to carry that heavy thing around? No one really needs internet all day, every day. And they kind of made fun of it at first. Obviously, the smartphone is one of those things that we almost all have, right? And so, what used to be really small, iPhone creates, Samsung copies. There's other companies that try to copy the smartphone, right? So even if we have this monopoly in certain cases, a monopoly on a smartphone, so to speak, people copy and they are eventually going to create something very similar. Okay, so anyway, kind of rare on a day-to-day basis, but they do occur in terms of for short periods of time. Some other examples: patents and copyrights, and we'll talk about utilities here in a second also. Patents and copyrights are also examples of monopolies for super specific things, right? So patents cover things like inventions, if you want to put your mind around that. Copyrights are other intellectual works like books or characters in a book, and those types of things that people can't copy. Okay, but those are real specific things, and they usually have substitutes, right? Like books, like Harry Potter would be copyrighted, but we can read another book. Okay, so we just can't read another book about Harry Potter that was written by somebody. You understand? So anyway, usually very specific things can be examples of monopolies. Um, and if we do create a monopoly where we have people that need our stuff, um, we do have some pretty substantial control over prices. Obviously, there's a major advantage for businesses. They can raise their price if people if people are going to still choose to buy it. Um, and for us, it's we are forced to buy from one producer. Okay, so not necessarily a good thing. We like that capitalist idea. We like to have choices, right, where we can do any number of things. If you want to talk about some, if you want to talk about some, just kind of historical context or some government language, okay, um, they might call a monopoly a trust, okay? And if a trust is formed, meaning that maybe two competitors, we kind of talked about this with collusion a little bit about oligopolies, but a trust might be formed between two big companies and they come together, they merge, and they create some monopoly power. Now, in the late 1800s, with this, we talked before about like how the government really had no rules with the economy. It was true capitalism. Like the government's like, we're hands off, we're not doing anything. Well, people figure out how to take advantage of not having any rules. We see these monopolies, these trusts form, okay, and the government gets involved and say, okay, this isn't right. We got to play referee here. We've got to start getting involved. And sometimes you might hear this term antitrust legislation, okay, and again, trying to break up monopolies so monopolies can't take advantage of consumers. This was a bigger deal than what you might realize if you remember the progressive era and you talk about like the things about child labor and pollution and those types of things the government tried to get rid of. There was also a guy named Teddy Roosevelt, and he was called the trust buster, right? And then what and as I mean, as uninteresting as it might have seemed at the time learning it, it was a big deal when the government got involved in breaking up huge companies and huge corporations and these merging companies. Now, there are three types of monopolies that are considered legal. Okay, so I just kind of mentioned that the government tries to prevent these monopolies. They try to not allow them. Okay, but there are three types of legal monopolies, and you'll want to know these vocab words. Okay, first of all, if there's just a company, let's just say there's a single gas station in a town. Okay, that would be an example of a resource monopoly. These are pretty rare because, again, the capitalist mindset says, hey, if a gas station's in a town and they're super successful, somebody's going to go and um, build another gas station, right? With this capitalist idea, there's a reason why McDonald's and Burger King are always kind of right next to each other, right? So that would be an example of a resource monopoly. In terms of like on a global scale, extremely rare, right? Resources, the availability of them, and communication and things like that are readily available and not necessarily um, able to sustain some type of monopoly situation where there's only one producer of something. Now, as much as I said the government doesn't want monopolies, they do create some, so to speak. We mentioned the patents and copyrights; those are protected by the government. And if you go back to the barriers to entry, right? Like, what is a difficult barrier to entry? Well, if I can't copy someone's invention, the government's going to charge me with that, right? Or somebody's going to sue me, and the government's going to support them. Okay, that would be a very high barrier to entry. Okay, so patents and copyrights are created by the government. Sometimes the government, Concord High School included, they might only provide one type of product in a concession stand. So, for example, at Concord High School, you can only buy Pepsi products if you're inside Concord High School. So that would be an example of a monopoly, but obviously the price controlling in there is pretty significant. So they can't just charge whatever price, right? Pepsi can't come in and charge $5 a pop for a concession stand. So again, those prices are set by Concord High School. Basically, Pepsi gives Concord High School a set amount of money. I don't know how much it is to sell only Pepsi products. Now, the last one is significant because, again, this is going to represent things that are like necessities. And I have it underlined here. You can see utilities. Okay, so your gas, water, and electric, basically. Um, these are controlled by private companies, but they are limited by the government. So basically, the government says, hey, listen, everybody needs electricity. We could have a lot of competitors for electricity, but electrical power lines are kind of a mess. We don't really want to deal with that. So let's just make sure that we enforce some rules for these electric companies to be allowed to operate. Okay, so The word is weird. The natural monopolies, I'm not sure where the word comes from, but the government does create those natural monopolies simply because, like I said, it's just easier to have one producer than multiple and then have them regulated by the government pretty significantly. Okay, so they're trying to be more efficient in those ways. As we said, monopolies for consumers. Not only are prices going to be set high because we don't have price competition, okay, but firms also are going to have less incentive to make their product better, right? The fact that Samsung has come out with a competitive smartphone with Apple has made Apple have to improve its product, right? And on the flip side, Samsung has to keep its product improving to be able to compete with Apple. So that competition is a good thing, not only for pricing, okay, in the long run, but also just for that competitive nature of innovation and how companies compete against each other to for the quality of their product. Okay. One other term you might hear is referred to as price discrimination. That's changing the price based on who's buying it. So it results somewhat often, I guess, but the government does try to prevent that. So, for example, okay, one way that price discrimination occurs, but they justify it, and I'll explain how, is that teenagers pay way more for car insurance than adults, right? And the way that they justify is they say, well, teenagers get in more car accidents, so we have to charge them higher money. Again, is an example of price discrimination. It's not necessarily against the law; it's justified by them. It's just kind of crappy, right? So, in the flip side, there's also health insurance, right? And young people pay very low costs for health insurance. All righty. On the flip side, old people would have to pay a lot because they're not good at staying healthy, so to speak, right? So the government prevents that price discrimination. That's a different topic for a different day. We'll talk about that next week. All right, second daily blog here. You're going to answer these questions yes or no, okay? And again, they're pretty straightforward. I'll give you a second to do that. So, number one and number two, talking about preventing pollution and maintaining roads, is what we're going to talk about for this last section. And this last section here, these are referred to, or we're going to talk about what happens when, you know, true capitalism doesn't necessarily work. Okay. So again, the idea of true capitalism is that we have to use the profit incentive to be able to produce stuff. Okay, well, we know the government produces certain things. Okay, so we're going to talk about that today. Before we talk about what the government produces, we're also going to talk about if true capitalism gets left unregulated. Okay, and what forms with that is referred to as externalities. And you can read there it's a side effect of production or consumption that has consequences for people other than the producer or consumer. The best example of an externality is pollution. Okay, so the idea that pollution makes our air worse, but the companies that are creating it are earning a profit. Again, 1800s, okay, we said the government was going to stay out of people's business. Companies, to save money and be as efficient as possible, they would just dump all of their waste into rivers, right, or into the environment. And that creates a big problem, obviously, in the long run. It still is a problem, probably not as bad as it used to be, but obviously there are some talks about how big of a problem that is. And so even if you think it's not that big of a problem, I think we can all agree that if a river catches fire, right, that's going to be a bad thing. This happened in the 1950s, I believe. Don't hold me accountable for that. But in the 50s or 60s in Cleveland, okay, their river caught on fire because all of the steel mills dumping chemicals into the river caught fire. Same thing happened in Russia in the mid 2000s. Okay, so we can all agree that even if we don't think pollution is that big of a deal, if we pollute enough to have a river catch on fire, that's not good. Okay, so anyway, we also have not only so the pollution, which is an example of a negative externality, that makes things bad. Okay, and obviously making our life worse. We also have some positive externalities. Okay, these are benefits. I'm going to use examples of like owning a home. So let's say you own a home, right? And after a certain amount of time, you decide to move. Okay. And after, when you decide to move, the problem is while you live there, a smelly factory gets built across the street. Hopefully you are able to understand that's going to make the value of your home go down. Okay, because not as many people want to live next to a smelly factory. That's a cost. We could measure that by the value if we wanted to of how much that cost you. Okay. On the flip side, I would also say like there's a reason why people would not want train tracks built next to their house, right? We know those of you that live anywhere near the school, we can hear trains very, very often, right? Now, they didn't build those train tracks when you bought after you bought your house, okay? We've bought those houses since the train tracks have been there. So again, understanding that that's not necessarily an externality, it was a negative externality for the people that were living here when the train tracks were built. And I don't know when that was. Okay, now an example of also could be a benefit. Okay, so maybe you have a house and a school gets built across the street. People like to live near schools. There's usually a police presence, right? The idea that it's safer. Also, you know that there aren't going to be, um, neighbors building houses across the street. People like their space, and so there can be positive and externalities too. Those are benefits, okay, or a profit, so to speak. I guess you could, if you wanted to look at it, since we said cost on the negative externalities. Now, there's also things that the government provides for us. Again, the idea of capitalism is we've got to produce stuff to make a profit. Well, there's certain things that are produced that don't make profits. Okay, and I list them down here. If I built a road, how would I charge people to use it? So the government provides roads for us, right? There is the toll road that they can make a profit. They can collect revenue by people driving on it. But there's also other examples down here: fire, police services, military, even getting to the point where some healthcare is provided by the government and public parks. Okay, so just to kind of give you an example of why fire and police services exist, I'm going to use the fire department example. And this example happened a few years ago. It was actually in Montana, I believe. Montana looks way different uh, land wise than what Elkhart does. Very rural, very wide open, and they don't have big cities or even small cities that would be able to support a fire department. Well, a particular small town wanted an emergency response system, and so they went and took money from volunteers, and these volunteers obviously were trying to pay for a fire department. Well, some people said, I don't want to pay for this. I'm not dumb enough to burn my house down. I'm not going to pay for this. So anyway, time goes on. The story wouldn't occur, obviously, if one of those people that didn't pay for it, his house caught on fire. Okay, so the fire department shows up. When they showed up, they realized this person did not pay for the fire department. So the fire department let his house burn to the ground while keeping his neighbors' houses wet, so they did not catch on fire also. Okay, so whether or not you think that that's fair, again, the government tries to prevent that situation in all cases, okay, in most cases. It's similar to all these fire and police services, national defense, healthcare, even. It's kind of an insurance program, right? We don't want something bad to happen. We don't know if something bad is going to happen, but if something bad does happen and our house catches on fire, we want to be able to count on that insurance program, so to speak, right? Like car insurance. If people didn't have car insurance and they got in a car accident and then they said, okay, now I want car insurance companies would not be able to sustain themselves. Okay, so that's why the government provides some things for us. Um, Pretty straightforward. We refer to those as public goods. Okay, we refer to those as public goods. So again, basically, long story short, private companies have not been able to um, figure out a way to make a profit on some of those things. Okay, for your assignment today, okay, we have all four of these. You should have all four of these market structures listed, right? You have the characteristics, you fill them all out. So your assignment today is going to involve you picking out a company. And if you've gotten started on your business presentation assignment, you may want to use that if you're a virtual student. You can. Um, if you are a hybrid student, you've been here, you probably want to use a different business. Okay. So you're going to pick what business you're going to analyze. Okay. You can pick any business. You want to do something you're familiar with. Okay. So let's just say that I'm going to pick Let's just say I'm going to pick Nike. Okay, so I type Nike in here, and I'm going to start analyzing how Nike competes against existing companies. All right, so what industry is my business? Now, Nike does a few different things, right? I can be super broad. I can say sports apparel, right? I can say sports apparel, super broad. It's going to change my competitors. So if I say sports apparel, we've got, Adidas, Under Armour, Reebok. There's even other types of sports apparel that are probably a little bit off-brand. Off the top of my head, I can't think. Or I can even make it more specific, and I can say, okay, I'm going to go to basketball shoes. Okay, and now things become significantly more concise, right? Under Armour, Adidas, I think New Balance makes some basketball shoes, right? And it's going to change my answers down the list. Okay, so based on those answers, you're going to again answer the questions. After you get all those done, you're going to take your answers and notice I have the indicators here of the different market structures listed, right? So if you look at these, right, number of producers, similar to products, barriers to entry, control over prices, and I give you some examples in there too. You're going to take those answers and you're going to say what market structure does my business fall into. All right, and you're going to give me two reasons. You're going to justify it. Remember, we said at the beginning a couple days ago that it doesn't really matter what you think. It matters how you explain it. Okay, so again, if you can explain it, and then you're going to be all right using some of these answers here. Okay, now, so for example, what I get sometimes is people don't think, and they'll say, okay, I'm doing Nike basketball shoes. I'm going to list some. I'm going to list some competitors: Adidas, Reebok, uh, Under Armour. Okay, so I list those, and then they'll go down here and they'll say Monopoly. That can't be right. There's more than one producer, right? If you're looking at your chart here, right, going back to Monopoly stuff, if you're looking at that, you know that monopolies have one producer, right? So you're going to walk. I'm going to go through. I'm going to check your answer. I'm going to read number 11 first. I'm going to say, okay, they say monopoly. All right, then I'm going to go check the number of producers. Well, there's more than one producer. Then you get number 10. Then you get number 11 incorrect. Okay, so notice it's 15 points total. Also, you got 10 points just for saying what analyzing your company, and then you get 5 points down at the bottom if you get that answer correct. Okay, which again, you get it correct by justifying what you wrote in 1 through 10. Okay, starting a new chapter tomorrow. We'll make sure that we keep things going here. We got 2 weeks left before finals, so make sure you're staying on task. Don't hesitate to email me about the business presentation, and we will keep it going here. Okay, we'll talk soon.